Evolution. How does it happen? Many people have seen something that looks a lot like this, called the March of Progress. But this depiction can be quite confusing. Many people wonder if we came from monkeys, then why are there still monkeys running around while we're also still on Earth? That's because this is a common misconception. I can assure you that the monkeys at your local zoo are not going to break out and try to take over. In order to have a better understanding of evolution, we first need to look at something called the phylogenetic tree. These are maps of evolutionary history. They show the relationships among organisms or their genes. The root is the common ancestor of all the organisms on the tree. Each node is where the lineages split apart, and this is where a speciation event occurred. We'll talk about speciation in a little bit. The branches are where the population of species emerged after the speciation event. All the little red dots are called synapomorphies, and these are shared morphological traits or genes that the species after that point all have in common. And the tips are the last known species of the trees. They could be extant species, which are species that are still alive, like us, or they could be extinct, like the dodo bird. And all of this is going on through time, so these changes are happening over millions and billions of years. Within the trees, we have different groups as well. First, we have polyphyletic groups, which you can think of like randomness. These groups don't include a common ancestor. Next is paraphyletic. This group does include a common ancestor, but it does not include all of the descendants of that group, just some of them. Finally, we have monophyletic. This group includes the common ancestor and all of the descendants of that ancestor. The easiest way to distinguish a monophyletic group is that the entire group can be removed from the tree with just a single cut. Like I said, the tips of the phylogenetic trees are species, and a species is a group of interbreeding individuals that have a common ancestry and are reproductively isolated from other such groups. Many people may think that there is a clear definition between species that anyone can see, but that is a common misconception. Speciation is the formation of a new species, and there are so many different ways that a new species can branch off that it gets a little complicated trying to flush out the differences sometimes. There are two major forms of speciation. Allopatric speciation is when a population becomes geographically isolated from each other to the point where gene flow is restricted. Sympatric speciation happens in the same geographic location, but other barriers are put into place. Just a couple we will discuss is prezygotic and postzygotic barriers. To represent allopatric speciation, we have this population of red foxes, but then, oh no, an earthquake happens and splits the population into two separate areas. Now, over a long time, gene flow has been restricted so much that now we have two different species. And because their genetic makeup is so different, they would no longer be able to produce viable offspring if they were ever geographically reunited. First, for sympatric speciation, we will discuss prezygotic barriers, which means that there is a barrier before an egg ever thinks about getting fertilized. One example would be behavioral isolation. Here we have two foxes that look a lot alike, but their mating behaviors are drastically different. The fox on the left barks as a mating call, and the one on the right howls. This would be like someone trying to profess their love to you in a language you don't understand. And since they can't understand each other, they're not able to attract one another. The next is temporal isolation. Some species have different breeding seasons, or even times of the day. So if one breeds at night and the other during the day, then they would likely never cross paths in order to attract each other. The last prezygotic barrier we will discuss is habitat isolation. So even if they have the same mating call, are in the same general area, and breed at the same time of the day, none of that matters if they prefer different habitats. One fox prefers open field while the other prefers cave dwelling. Once again, they're likely to never cross paths. On to postzygotic barriers. This means that all the circumstances were right and two organisms were able to breed. But something goes awry after fertilization occurs. Here we have a horse and a donkey. Most people know that they are different species, but they are still able to fall in love, mate, and even produce offspring, which is the mule. But the mule is sterile and therefore not able to pass on its genetic information. Aw, so sad. This is known as reduced hybrid fertility. Another barrier is reduced hybrid viability. This is when the fertilization occurs, but the embryo is basically too defective, so it will either lead to miscarriage, stillbirth, or the hybrid will only live for a few days. This is because the gametic genetic information is just too different to be compatible. Let's move under the sea, where we have dolphins and sharks. At first glance, it's pretty obvious that these two organisms are closely related, right? They both have dorsal, tail, and pectoral fins, and they're both aquatic. What about this one? This is an extinct species called the ichthyosaur. It too has a lot of these same features, so it'd be safe to say that all three of these species are closely related, am I right? Let's take a little bit of a closer look before answering that. We see that the shark has a vertical tail fin that moves side to side for propulsion, while the dolphin has a horizontal tail fluke that moves up and down for propulsion. The shark has pectoral fins with cartilage inside, while the dolphin has a flipper containing modified hand bones from when its ancestors used to walk on land. The shark has gills used for breathing water, while the dolphin has a blowhole at the top of its head for breathing air. Lastly, the shark has additional fins down below, like a second dorsal, pelvic, and anal, while the dolphin has mammary glands down below for nursing their young with milk. After these comparisons, do you still think that they're closely related? If you said yes, you'd be wrong. As you can see from this phylogenetic tree, sharks are way over on the left side, categorized as cartilaginous fish. Dolphins are in the middle, categorized as a mammal, and as you can see, are more closely related to a cow than to a shark. And just for fun, all the way on the right side, you see our friend the ichthyosaur, categorized as a reptile. This is another one of those common misconceptions. People often think that if two organisms look similar, then they must be closely related, because how else would they both have these traits? And this is what we call convergent evolution. This is when two organisms have similar traits that were evolved completely separate from each other, not inherited from a common ancestor. This is the same concept behind butterflies and birds having wings, but not being closely related at all. Backtracking a bit, I'm going to tell you a little story. This is the theory of how modern eukaryotes evolved from prokaryotes, and it's called the endosymbiotic theory. Once upon a time, there were only prokaryotic cells. It is believed that a larger prokaryote engulfed a smaller one, and somehow it survived, and began benefiting the larger one by providing it with more energy than it's ever had. This type of relationship is known as symbiotic. Both organisms live together while providing a benefit for one another. The smaller prokaryote is what we now know as the mitochondria, and of course we all know that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. This is because it takes oxygen and nutrients and turns it into energy for us. Then, a long time later, another smaller prokaryote was engulfed and once again survived. This is what we now know as the chloroplast in plant cells. This symbiotic relationship was a bit different though, because the chloroplast takes light from the sun and turns that into usable energy for the organism. I know what you're thinking though. This is a great story, but where are the facts? Mitochondria and chloroplasts have their own DNA separate from the DNA of the organism they're a part of. Their DNA is arranged similarly to prokaryotic DNA. They're the size of bacteria, and they divide similarly to bacteria. The endosymbiotic theory goes to show how the thought process of something emerging from the primordial ooze and just deciding to evolve is actually just another common misconception. Because evolution isn't something that has a plan, it's something that just happens. One of these evolutionary processes that leads to speciation events is mutations. Okay, let's start simple. Mutations are a change in an organism's DNA, and there's two major types, genetic and chromosomal. For genetic mutations, the sequence of the gene will change. And remember, when we're talking about the sequence of the genes, we're talking about the nucleotides, or base pairs on DNA. And when DNA is being read, it's read in groups of 3, and those 3 letters make up the codon, which codes for a particular amino acid. If an amino acid is changed, it could lead to a change in the protein that the DNA is trying to make, which could lead to a mutation. So we have our frameshift mutations, which is going to be insertion and deletion. With insertion, an extra base is added into the sequence. With deletion, a base is taken out of the sequence. So both of these are referred to as frameshift mutations because they're a shift in the reading frame. And since the bases are read in groups of 3, when there's an extra or missing base, the frame isn't being read properly. So something's being cut out or added in that shouldn't be there. Then we have substitution, which is also called point mutations. This is where a base has been swapped out for a different base. This may not be a big deal as long as the amino acid isn't changed. If the amino acid isn't changed, then we'll call those synonymous mutations. You may also hear it called silent or neutral. However, if that point mutation does change the amino acid, we call those non-synonymous mutations. And these may not be harmful, but sometimes they can be. Take, for example, our beta hemoglobin gene for our red blood cells. Typically, there's a codon for that gene that reads GAG, which codes for glutamine. If the point mutation changes it to GAA, it's still coding for glutamine, which means that our red blood cells remain normal. However, if the point mutation changes it to GTG, that is now coding for valine, and this is how individuals end up with sickle cell anemia. If an individual ends up with 2 copies of this gene from both parents, then they will have the disease. But if they only end up with 1 copy, that makes them a carrier, which incidentally gives them a protective factor against malaria. Which leads us to a big point in a lot of mutations. There's typically a trade-off factor. Then we have chromosomal mutations. For these, there's a change in the structure or the number of chromosomes. So we have deletion, where we end up with the structure change because an entire section is deleted out of the chromosome. The new chromosome ends up being shorter and missing a lot of information. There's duplication, where an entire section of the chromosome gets duplicated and repeated on the next one, which makes it longer. And then there's inversion, where 2 different gene segments get flipped. We also have insertion for chromosomal mutations, and this is where a gene segment from one chromosome gets inserted into another chromosome. And finally, there's translocation, where 2 gene segments from 2 different chromosomes switch places. Now that we've discussed some structural changes, let's move on to a change in the number of chromosomes. This is called aneuploidy. A typical normal person has 46 chromosomes. A person with aneuploidy is going to have either more or less. Let's take, for example, trisomy 21. They have an extra chromosome in their 21st set. Now you may be thinking, I've never heard of this before, but it's actually more common than you might think. It's commonly referred to as Down syndrome. And though we can't be certain to specific causes of mutations, we speculate mutagens to be the primary culprit. This would be radiation, chemicals, or even consumable items. Now comes another common misconception. When most people think about mutations and mutagens, they may think of characters like the X-Men or Spider-Man, who was bit by a radioactive spider and then inherited extraordinary abilities. This isn't really how it works, though. In order for Spider-Man to have all those abilities, there would have to be multiple genes and chromosomes that would have mutated, and mutations typically work on a smaller scale. Mutations are random. They're happening constantly and naturally. And as we discussed, they can be neutral, beneficial, or harmful. But they are what scientists call the ultimate source of variation. Speaking of random, our next topic is genetic drift, which is change in the gene pool that takes place as a result of random chance. This is when allele frequencies drift up or down randomly over time and leads to a decrease in genetic variation. Think of when you're walking down the sidewalk and you step on some bugs by mistake. It was completely random that you maybe stepped on some green ones, which left a disproportionately more amount of brown bugs in the population. We have 2 types of genetic drift. For the first one, we have our little population of foxes in the forest. There's brown, red, and gray. Then the forest catches fire. When the flames settle, we see that some of our foxes weren't so lucky, and it just so happens that all of our gray foxes didn't make it. You can see how having one less color decreases genetic variation. This is called the bottleneck effect, and it is the change in allele frequencies when a population is drastically reduced in size. Typically, some alleles are eliminated, like our poor gray foxes, which causes others to be overrepresented. In our next example, we have our happy little fox population once again. But this time, a couple of our little red foxes caught a ride on some driftwood after a storm. We can see that they are heading straight for that little island. This is called the founder effect, and it is a change in allele frequencies when a new population is founded. It will be a very small population size, and as you can see, only red foxes are the founders. It will lead to a drastic decrease in genetic variation. Speaking of variation, it's time we talk about a very special phenomenon concerning these two lizards. These are the Pisgah lizards, and as you can see, they have two different color variations that just so happen to match their environment. One lives in sandy areas, while the other lives on lava flows. This is great for the lizards because they blend into their environment, which makes them harder for predators to see. But what happens if we have the lizards switch places? Put the black lizard in a sandy environment and the tan lizard on the lava flows. Clearly, you're all thinking that they're doomed because now they're easily spotted by predators, right? Well, that's just another one of those pesky common misconceptions. For you see, I did say that these lizards are special, and special lizards get to break the rules. But how, you may ask? That's easy. These lizards have the ability to change their coloring. It was found that after a while in the new environment, the lizards would begin to change color to match their new environment. When you look at our DNA, we have genotypes containing information for what we look like, be it eye color, hair color, or skin color. And these lizards have a single genotype that produces more than one phenotype. This is called phenotypic plasticity. Organisms that have this trait are able to have higher fitness to be selected for because they're able to do well in an environment with a lot of variation. You are onto something with the lizards being safer while blending into their environment, though. This is a big part of natural selection. This is when an organism is best suited in their environment and therefore live longer, reproduce more, and pass on their genes, which makes them more commonly seen in the population because there's more of them. The most notable example is the case of the peppered moths. Their habitat is birch trees, which are pretty light in color due to lichen. The peppered moths have two color variations, and as you can imagine, the light-colored moths tend to have higher fitness since they blend in better. However, in the 1800s came the Industrial Revolution, and with that came factories that were ran by coal to produce goods. The coal released soot into the air, which turned all the birch trees black. At this point, the darker moths had an advantage over the light moths for survival. Tell me, can you spot the moths in each of these birch tree forests? Noticeable evolutionary change happens when natural selection acts on many generations, and that's exactly what happened with these moths. Okay, time's up. Here's the light moth, and here's the dark one. Can you see how each one is best suited for their different environments? Can you spot the moths now? Here and here. They're much easier to see when they don't blend into their environments. Once the black moth had an advantage, more and more of them were commonly seen in the population over generations. So that's that for the white moths then, huh? Once the tide turns in one direction, it's sayonara for the other. Wrong. Though that could be the case in another situation, it's not in this one. Once people realized that pollution was bad, factories reduced their emissions and the trees returned to their lighter state, meaning that over generations, the light-colored moths once again reigned supreme over the birch forests. A special case of natural selection is sexual selection. It acts on an organism's ability to mate with a member of the opposite sex. Here we have 3 variations of the side-blotched lizard. Interestingly enough, each color variation means a particular sexual variation as well. The orange lizards are polygamous. They have lots of female interests that they mate with and try to protect from others. They're like the big macho guys. The blue lizards are monogamous. They prefer to mate with one female and focus on only protecting her. So he's the real nice guy next door type. And then we have the yellow lizards. They're the sneakers. They will mate with whoever they can get their grubby little claws on. They're the type of guy you don't want to catch yourself alone in a dark alley with. So how is it that these guys keep a harmonious balance? With a game of rock, paper, scissors, of course. The orange rock beats blue scissors because orange hoards most of the ladies, so there's less to choose from for blue. Blue scissors beats yellow paper because blue only has one lady to keep an eye on, so yellow has a slim chance of sneaking in and mating with blue's lady. And yellow paper beats orange rock because orange has way too many ladies to keep an eye on. So yellow has more opportunities to sneak in and mate with orange's ladies without orange ever noticing. You might be thinking that eventually one or more of these varieties will win the ultimate game of natural selection, right? Wrong again. The most interesting part of this is that researchers have found the females actually have preferences and typically choose whoever is the underdog. So each season, a new variety is the top dog. The females keep the genetic variety in check. This is also seen with peacocks. The females are just kind of lumps of brown feathers, but the males have these huge, colorful, flashy tails in order to catch the attention of the available females and successfully mate with them. The females prefer males with bigger, flashier tails. Males are typically the ones that sexual selection acts most obviously on because they produce more gametes than females and are not taken out of the operational sex ratio every time they successfully mate. Females, however, are taken out of that ratio because they're developing eggs, carrying embryos, or caring for their young. Therefore, males need to be able to compete with other males because basically, there's just too many options.